Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and this is episode 31, Dual Prophecies and the New Testament. First of all, I want to thank everybody who has sent in all of their messages and condolences from all aspects of social media and email, and being patient and helping me through over the last 6 weeks or so as I've been tending to a number of personal events that have demanded my undivided attention to get through. And I'm now starting to emerge from that, where I've got more things under control and finding more time to devote to my passion and my work, not only on the Christian Contrarian, but other shows that I interview on, and posting in social media and answering questions and all of the things that I love to do in the work that I do. So again, I just want to thank everybody for that, and we're going to continue with part 2 of the dual prophecies that I finished off with in episode 30. And so many people may want, if you're not familiar with that show then and the details out of that show, you may want to go back to see that show after seeing this show, and go back and review it if you have seen it, because we're going to try and connect some dots. And I know it's been a little bit of time since I did my last show. And so just as a sort of a quick recap, we talked about things in terms of dual prophecies that they are rather unique, and there's a whole series of them. And we talked about passages or chapters like Isaiah 13, 14, 22, 25, 34 as ones out of the book of Isaiah, Ezekiel 28, 29, 31, 32, and Jeremiah 50, 51, and there are more. But these are the major ones from the major prophets, and they tell a very interesting tale that most people find rather confusing. And so if you recall from episode 30, we talked about that these prophecies were made in and relevant to the time of the current prophet. So Isaiah would have been in the time of the Assyrian apocalypse, as I like to call it, but certainly the time of testing for Israel and then their taking into exile. And just as Jeremiah and Ezekiel would have been with prophets of the time of the southern kingdom and the Babylonian diaspora in exile into Babylon. And it's important to keep that in mind, so you understand that not only do those prophecies have to make sense in that time or shortly thereafter because it's a prophecy, but these prophecies have details that at first read seem to be in conflict with the details of what happened in that period of time, whether it was with Assyria or the time of Babylon and the beast empires that they are exerting over the ancient world of that time. And that these prophecies also seem to entail references to history before that period, and more specifically, more and more often, to prehistory. And so there's very important information that we need to understand about prehistory to make sense that when it's talking about prehistory in those prophecies, that we don't conflate it into the prophecy, and that they have a dual impact and overflow into the end time, and that nothing is new under the sun, and that things will be done sort of over and over and over. And we need to understand that the end time is just a replay of what already has been done in most respects, and we just need to understand the prehistory so that we can understand end time prophecy, which is one of my underpinnings for interpreting prophecy in the approach that I take, along with all the other disciplines that sort of keep it in a directional understanding that tends to relieve the conflicts. And so I won't go through all of my disciplines, but again, this one is really focusing on how prehistory is important to understand the allegories and what is taking place in the end time and what was taking place at the time of these prophets. Very, very important information. And that what has happened in the past, as in Isaiah 14, where you've got Satan who is in a rebellion and he wants to be like God and raise his throne to heaven to be like God and to have his own realm like God, have his own organizational structure like God. This is going to happen throughout history, but through the offspring of the fallen angels, which again is a prehistory event. And if you don't understand Genesis 6, you really miss a lot of the meaning of end time prophecy and what is going on in ancient history. So it's important to understand that and connect those dots, because the beast empires are the offspring dynasties of the post-Diluvian Rephaim, which are the post-Diluvian giants, as opposed to the Nephilim that were created before the flood. And so it's these beast empires that are permitted to operate on earth for a certain time, until the end time when we get the last of those beast empires. So we need to understand that beast empire of the end time is coming out of these Rephaim, Satan, and rebellious angels sponsored empires that is going to resurface in the end time. So very, very important details. And so when we start reading prophecy and references to prehistory in the New Testament, we need to understand these details. And we also need to understand those details to unpack what Jesus is telling us in Matthew 24, and Mark 13, and Luke 17, and Luke 21, and many other passages in the New Bible, like 2 Peter chapter 3, where you have a time in the end time where people are ignorant of what happened in the old time, in the destruction of old, when the waters were collapsed upon each other, which is why you have a separation of the waters in days 1 through 6, and the earth perished, and noting that the earth didn't perish with the flood. And if you want a detailed account of all of this and how it works in terms of the destruction before day 1, as I would interpret and understand 2 Peter chapter 3, then you may want to go to the True Legends, and I do a 2.5-hour presentation on what I call the renewal of the earth. And it really sheds some light on answering a lot of things in prehistory, and sheds a lot of light in terms of impacting the end time. Having said that, not having that as an influence on what I'm talking about today, because I don't want to get people confused or sidetracked, we need to understand that the end time is reserved for fire, where it will be perished again by fire, just as it was in what I was just talking about. And so there's an end time of destruction of fire, which I think we're quite well versed in, that there'll be an apocalyptic nature to the end time that has probably something like nuclear weapons and things like that that are going on. So understanding prehistory will help you unpack what is being talked about in 2 Peter and the apocalypse of fire that is coming. It will also help you understand Revelation, which is absolutely loaded with allegory and references to things that happened in the end time. So if you really want to understand Revelations, you have to understand prehistory, and then you got to place all of that information in Revelation in the chronology that Jesus provides to us in the chapters that I had mentioned before, starting with Matthew 24. And when you do that, things start to make some sense, because you have things like Revelation 9 and the abyss, which is clearly a reference back to prehistory and what is in the abyss. And as it relates to the Gog War, and understanding Gog is one of the leaders and an antichrist figure, you take that back to Greek in the New Testament, and that this is a war that Antichrist is going to use to come to power on as a counterfeit Armageddon, to come before Jesus and to become a fake Messiah. So all of this is really important, just as the descriptions of what's going on in the Gog War, which is the Joel 1 and 2 war, and the 200 million man war in Revelation 9. So it's important to understand that. And so we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about how that relates to a few New Testament passages and verses, prehistory and the dual prophecies, and Revelation 9. So we're going to talk about Revelation 9 first, and that is referencing the abyss, as some English translations will call the bottomless pit, as it's recorded in the King James Version. So what's interesting about this is, as we're talking about the bottomless pit and the abyss, and as we talked about in episode 30, we were talking about the pit, and we're talking about the bottomless pit, and we're talking about Hades, and we're talking about the prisons that the angels and the Rephaim were imprisoned into. And we need to understand that when we see that word hell translated into English, that's a conflation of terms. And it's unfortunate that the translators have done that, because as you break it out in Greek and as you break it out in Hebrew, you understand that they're distinct. There's three different things going on in that conflated term of hell, which are conflated. And so you have the abyss, that is this place where the fallen angels are. And the abyss is the pit, and it's in the underworld, and that's separate from the lake of fire. So you have the underworld, which is Hades, you have the prison, which is the abyss or the pit or the dungeons, and then you have the lake of fire. Now the lake of fire is probably located maybe in a different dimension, and maybe even in a different place. But the abyss is located in the underworld. So having said that, when we look at the word bottomless pit, the first word is bottomless, which is abusos, which is the abyss. So that's kind of where we get that understanding coming out of the New Testament for the abyss. And then the pit is friere, which means hole, abyss, and prison, and aligns up with the pit definition as in Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 31 and 32 that we talked about in the first part of this two-part episode. And so you have a prison that is in the abyss or the underworld. That's how you would understand the New Testament definition, as opposed to being in Hades or Sheol, as you would have the underworld, and then the pit would be that prison in the underworld. And so this starts to make sense of 2 Peter 2:4, where you have hell, that conflated term, but that comes from the Greek word tartaru, for the Greek Tartarus, a prison, where the heroes and some of the gods of the angelic world were imprisoned. Right? Makes perfect sense as a parallel polytheist understanding of what the true accurate details of monotheism in the Bible talks about. So everything sort of lines up. And then in 2 Peter 2:4, you have the angels that sinned went to jail, which is that prison, right? And you have in Jude 1:6 that these angels are imprisoned until the judgment. And so these are the impassioned angels, and these are the Nephilim from before the flood. And if there's a second incursion, like I think, that's also the impassioned angels after the flood, and the Rephaim, the worst of them, are also put into the sides of the abyss. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And of course, those sides of the abyss are talked about in Ezekiel 31 and 32, and then Isaiah 14. So these are the disobedient angels, as 1 Peter talks about. The ones who sinned, as 2 Peter 2:4 talks about. The ones that are in the prison until judgment, that Jude talks about, the impassioned angels. And these are the angels that Jesus, while still in the grave, went to speak to. and likely the worst of the Nephilim and the Rephaim that are in the sides of the abyss. And I think what he told them is that when I rise on the Sunday, your rebellion is officially over, and all you can do is just continue to do more damage, but your date with destiny with the lake of fire is sealed. And that's what they continue to do today, is lead more people away so that all the names that were put in the name of the book won't end up there, and many will be erased. But the ones that aren't erased will be led into eternity. But angels are set up against that. They want to make sure that as few humans as possible will benefit from this. And in the beginning, and of course they didn't anticipate the resurrection, otherwise they wouldn't have had Jesus crucified, as Corinthians talks about. They tried to prevent the Messiah from coming. They tried to prevent Israel from producing the Messiah through the Judah Messianic bloodline. They tried to destroy the ancient world, and they've been trying to do this over and over and over and over, which is that nothing new under the sun thing that is going to come to fruition again in the end time. And in Revelation 9, you have these scorpion beings that are coming out, which I think are the Crab of Maloo and the Gird of Blue, which I've talked about several times, that are going to be in place for the time of the Gog War, which is the 200 million man war as that plays out at the end of Revelation 9. And the king that comes out is Abaddon Apollyon as their king, as their leader. And who I think, and I've done a couple shows about this in previous shows, that I think is Azazel, the goat god. The degraded seraphim goat god that is going to be the leader. And he's going to lead out these planet-destroying scorpion beings and the worst of the Rephaim and the Nephilim, which is going to bring about that counterfeit Armageddon that we were talking about. So you can start to see how important it is to understand the details and how it sort of fits, and how you can fit and start to understand some of the meanings that seem to be a little bit more obscure when it comes to New Testament prophecy and how it connects to Old Testament prophecy. And of course, this is the same abyss, the same bottomless pit that Satan is going to be sent to at the end of the last 7 years, that when Armageddon is over, and for 1,000 years, where he's released from the abyss again to start the same sort of havoc and lead another war on Jerusalem that is defeated again by Jesus, and then he's sent to the lake of fire. And the fallen angels are going to be sent to the lake of fire at the end of the end time. So before the start of the millennium, as Matthew talks about, they have been reserved for judgment in the lake of fire. So this prison is real. The lake of fire is real, and the underworld is real. Now, they may be in other dimensions or in different locations, but they are real, and we need to understand that when we're reading prophecy, because it's loaded with these types of terms and references to demons and references to fallen angels and references to dynasties, which are the beast kingdoms, and we need to understand this if we're going to make sense of what's going to be happening and what has happened. And so in the Old Testament, the abyss is part of the English transliterations of hell and for the pit, when you see that coming up in those dual prophecies that I mentioned earlier. And if we look at Isaiah 14, where you have the Hallel, which is the Hebrew for the Italian word Lucifer, inserted into the translation for the English translation, which makes no sense, but I've talked about that in the past. That's the same chapter as when we get a term called the chief ones of the earth. And again, most people, I don't hear people talking about this, but we're going to talk a little bit about these chief ones as it relates to everything that we're talking about right now. And that's the Hebrew word atud, A-T-T-W-D. And what it means is leaders, or leaders of goats, or a he-goat. And these are the satyr gods, just as Isaiah 13, which is another dual prophecy, and Isaiah 34, which is another dual prophecy that I've been talking about, will actually list the satyrs, which are the goat gods, which are the devil goat gods that Israel was talked about or told not to be worshiping, because those are the degraded fallen angels. Just as Azazel, Azaz, and El for his name, Azazel. Azaz means, stout and powerful in forces, and is related to the god of forces that Antichrist is going to honor, as the book of Daniel talks about. And that word Maus goes back to Hebrew words Azaz and Az, which is basically meaning the same thing as forces and fortresses, just as Azazel was the angel that introduced military tactics, the art of war, the art of manufacturing war. He introduced war to the ancient world. So he's the destroyer of the ancient world, and why he's likely the king of the abyss, Abaddon Apollyon, the destroyer. And Azazel shows up as the scapegoat in Leviticus 16, and that word scapegoat goes back to Azazel, and Azazel is rooted in the same EZ word for goat as Azaz and Maus goes back to. So this comes full circle. These are the chief ones of the earth. These are the degraded goat gods, like Bacchus, as he would be referred to in the Roman pantheon, or Pan and Baphomet that the Templars worship, Pan in the Greek mythology. And these are the ones that are in Hades and in hell. And this is the same place that Halel, Satan, in Isaiah 14 is going to be sent to in Isaiah 14, the same place that has the cells along the sides of the abyss that Ezekiel 31 and 32 talk about. That's for the Rephaim and the Nephilim, dead, slain kings, because their spirits aren't permitted to go to sleep and they're not permitted to go to heaven. These ones are the worst of those Nephilim kings and Rephaim kings, and they're not permitted to roam the earth like other demons do, as in Legion that Jesus had to deal with. They're actually in the abyss, and they're the ones that are talking to Pharaoh in Ezekiel 31 and 32 and other passages. So again, starts to connect some dots here for you. And as we talked about, the abyss holds more than just the fallen angels. So the Nephilim, the Rephaim, and probably other things like the scorpion being gods, or the Krabamaloo, as I think they are, and who knows what else is going to be coming out in the end time. The place where Satan is going to go at the end of the end time, and these angels that are locked there are going to be present before the midpoint of the last 7 years, and then are going to be joining in battle in the war in heaven at the middle point in Revelation 12. And we're going to see that take place in the heavens, and then they're all going to be on earth for the last 3.5 years. So a very significant part for the end time that we need to be aware of. And so these are the Rephaim and the Nephilim and the fallen angels that are sent to the nether parts of the earth in Ezekiel 31, 14, and 16. In the earth, probably in a different dimension, in Hades, in the pit, as it's described in the Old Testament, in the bottomless pit, or the abyss, as it's described in Tartarus in the New Testament, that's used for hell, that conflated term again. And that's also showing up in Ezekiel 32, 18 and 24, if you want to have a look at that. And pit is the Hebrew word as it's used in the Old Testament, boz, meaning dungeon, prison, and cistern. So you can see how the pit in Hades, in Sheol, is the same thing that's being talked about in the New Testament. And Satan in Isaiah 14:15 is going to be sent to the stones of the abyss. And I'm not sure what that refers to, but Azazel, in a lot of accounts, has stones tied to him. So I'm sure there's something that's going to happen with Satan in the abyss that's going to be similar to what happened to Azazel, where Satan's going to spend 1,000 years as he's sent there in Revelation 20 and then released at the end of the millennium. So now rolling this forward a little bit, we need to understand that in Ezekiel 32, as it relates to Revelation 9, Joel 1 and 2, and Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog War, is made up of people in there that are people of Babylon. So the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh from Egypt and Ashur, which is Assyria, and Elam, which is part of the Babylonian and Assyrian Empire, and Meshech and Tubal and the princes of the north, which are described in the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war. And these are the ones that are going to be released in the end time, including the Zidonians and the Edomites. So those bloodlines of Rephaim and Nephilim from those nations are going to be part of what's going to bring about the counterfeit Armageddon. And these are the sons of the worst of the Nephilim. They are the worst of the beast kings of the empires. These are the sons of perdition, as Antichrist is going to be called, of Apollyon and Abaddon, as you connect that back, who is Azazel, as I've talked about. And these are the terrible ones. And in Ezekiel 32, all of them have been slain who caused terror in the land of the living. And that's where they're imprisoned, in the sides of the abyss. And they're coming out with the fallen angels. They are the ones in Ezekiel 31:12. They are the terrible ones of the Gentile nations, the beast nations. They are, and also you can see that in Ezekiel 28:7, in 33:12, and in Isaiah 25:3. They're assigned by the gods as the terrible ones, as in King Habada of the cedar forest, to destroy humankind, to do the beckoning of Satan and the fallen angels so that we would not inherit our destiny, to be raised up, to be like angels, and actually to judge the angels for the crimes against humanity that they have done to us. In Isaiah 25:5, the Rephaim kings of the beast kingdoms, the 10 kings of the end time, will either be these resurrected Rephaim and Nephilim, or they're going to be bloodline ones. But what we do know is we're going to have Rephaim and Nephilim with us in the end time in some form or not. I tend to think that the empire is probably going to be led by the descendants, but we're also going to have these spirits coming out who are probably going to be in some sort of clone body or robotic body or some type of dwelling place, an Contrarian for their spirit, so they can interact with the physical world. Just as angels need a place for their dwelling space to have created these offspring to be a physical nature in the physical world because they're spiritual in their habitation. Contrarian is in heaven. And they left that, so they need a dwelling place for the spirit in the physical world. And this is the branch of the terrible ones, as Isaiah 25:5 talks about. These are going to be directly connected to the beast kingdom that comes up out of the sea from the Hydra, or the serpent dragon, the Satan-sponsored end-time empire, whom Antichrist receives his power from the dragon, and probably from Azazel, who he honors, because Azazel will be out, and Antichrist comes to power at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So again, you see how this starts to fit together. Isaiah 25:3, these terrible ones, like King Habada, from secularism. I like to put in references that people will understand that there's a polytheist recording of prehistory and a polytheist understanding of how the New Age plays out, which is their end time. We need to understand they want that time of destiny. They want that showdown. They're going to bring it about, but they can't until the restrainer is removed. And that doesn't happen until Antichrist is crowned. And we know that because if it's the Holy Spirit, it's the restrainer, it's still there in the first 3.5 years, helping the saints testify before the authorities. And if it's Michael, then he still permits the last empire to come as he fights against Persia and Greece and all the other beast empires, but he's preventing Antichrist from taking over. So he leaves at some point in time as Antichrist is rising, is going to be crowned, and probably at the time when the abyss is open, so all of this can play out, so Antichrist can deceive the world. And then he comes back to fight in Revelation 12 and Daniel 12 as when he stands up. And again, you got to put Revelation 12 and Daniel 12 together, but also understand Daniel 12 is about Judah and Israel and awakened Israel. So let's not conflate too much of that with the church. And of course, Revelation 12 is all about Judah fleeing, and then Satan turns to all of those who believe in Jesus. That is the remaining Christians that are on earth who haven't been slaughtered and or raptured by that time, depending on the timing of the rapture. And so if we understand that, these terrible ones and their descendants are going to be the ones ruling in the end time. If we understand that, that starts to make sense of Matthew 24 in the fig tree generation, which is an overarching understanding of this last godless generation that Timothy talks about, and Jesus gives us the chronology for that. Then we can understand what he said right after the fig tree generation, which is another overarching understanding, is that as the days of Noah were, so will the end time be. And so we need to understand what happened both before the flood and immediately after the flood, because the days of Noah, as it's exactly worded in Genesis 9:29, exactly the words that Jesus uses as it's translated from Greek into English in the English translation, is identical. And the meaning is identical as the Hebrew meaning. Jesus used that term as an overarching term. So it's more than just not expecting the end time, not expecting Armageddon and being a godless generation, but it's all the other events of both before and after the flood. And again, I think that's why Luke, in his recounting of the same words that Jesus said, he also includes not only the days of Noah, but the days of Lot. Sodom and Gomorrah. Probably one of the places, and maybe even the city of the terrible ones that was destroyed by God. Maybe the recreation, or one of the places of the recreation, but certainly is an important city to the polytheists that was destroyed. So it'll be like the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's by fire. And then that now connects the end time, where you have the Nephilim and the Rephaim after the flood. You have an apocalypse by water, but this time, as 2 Peter 3 was talking about, this age is reserved for fire. And I think what Luke is doing is he's connecting that type of disaster to the end time, which also happened before time and before the renewal of the earth. So when you start to look at all of these things and understand prehistory, it starts to make more sense. So I have documents on these dual prophecies, and if you want to get that information, get a hold of me either through Gary Wayne on Facebook, through my group, Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. You can ask for it there, or on Messenger, or on Twitter at GaryWayne63, or go to my website, thegenesis6conspiracy.com. That's the Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. And on there I've got an email. Ask me for the documents, ask me for some questions. And until next time, when I start into a whole new series of really interesting topics that people don't talk enough about, until the next time, until we start off in that direction, stay well, stay blessed, and may God bless you abundantly.